After winning the two biggest wars in human history, Britain has shrunken, not just physically, but in some way that's hard to describe. Its culture has changed. Some might say has been destroyed, and it's become something completely different. I'm not defending Hitler, of course, but it's just a fact that you weren't attacked. So when you say that Churchill saved Britain, well, Britain got into the war voluntarily. Praying for people can never be a crime, but it is a crime in Great Britain.
Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. Today we are going to be talking about America's interest in Britain, and particularly America's interest in Britain's decline. Because Tucker Carlson, the great TV star and journalist, was in Britain this week, and he did an interview with Piers Morgan and began it with a monologue about what's gone wrong with Britain, and he advanced various ideas, which we shall discuss now. And I'm joined by two limeys to discuss it. Not often we have two Brits on Americano, but it's great to have you both. I'm joined by Tim Stanley of the Daily Telegraph and Ed West, who writes the wonderful Substack, The Wrong Side of History. Sorry, I nearly forgot the name of your Substack there, Ed. But
that is fine.
I was about to call it the Rest is History, but then I realised...
The West is History. That's why I thought about changing it, but unfortunately I think their lawyers might object to that. So.
The Worst is History?
The West is history.
The West is History, right. Yeah, very good. Oh, because of your name. Very clever. Took a while. Anyway, let's get talking. What's going wrong with Britain? It might be the journalists. Tim, how did you feel? Did you watch Tucker's monologue, and how did it make you feel if you did?
I watched as much of it as I could, let's put it that way. I had an American friend visit a few weeks ago, and she called me and said, I'm going to stay in this location in London. Can you tell me if the area is safe? She was staying in Knightsbridge. I said, the only robbery you will face there is the cost of the minibar, right? But still, there is a popular idea abroad in America that we are some kind of ground zero in the decline of Western civilization. And I think it's worth remembering that 10 years ago, America thought this way about France. At the time of the 2016 election, it was post-Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan, etc. And much of the discourse in America was about, you don't want to become France. Since then, it's become, you don't want to become Britain. And that's because Britain's got real problems, which we can discuss. But it's also because of a political phenomenon, which is the marrying of Trump and Brexiteers. And as a consequence of that, America is just more conscious of what's going on in Britain than it used to be. It's as if its telescope had swung slightly to the west. And I think this is also a product of Trump himself. The irony of Trump is he is the president of the nativists, but he is, in personal terms, a total globalist. I interviewed Eric Trump, his son, a few weeks ago, who pointed out that as a child he spent time in London, that he does business in Scotland. And a simple reason why a lot of American right-wingers are talking about Britain is because they come here a lot. And so, okay, let's talk about the problems Britain's got. But I think it's also America is fixated on Britain because of the Trump phenomenon. A certain group of Americans happen to be setting the narrative.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Brexit, Tim, because one thing that often occurs to me is how much the New York Times might be responsible. And that's not on the American right, obviously. That's on the American left, because ever since Brexit, the New York Times, it's been very well documented by the Telegraph, by the Spectator and other publications, the number of times the New York Times has run a piece about the state of Britain, Britain in decline. There's a sort of idea that since Brexit, we've become a kind of collapsed populist mess. So it's on the left and the right of American politics, I think, is what I'm saying.
It is, and it's also a very long story. So in the wake of the Second World War, when America was debating whether the New Deal should be expanded or not, the American right tended to point to Britain as an example of what happens if you let socialist state planners take over. So you think for the last decades how often the NHS has been invoked as, you don't want Democrats running your healthcare because it'll look like the NHS. Now there are good reasons for this. It's because America is a byproduct of Britain. And that's one thing that Tucker Carlson and Piers touched upon. Americans care about us because they are our progeny. But the right has also been using us as a warning for a very long time. Now it's about immigration and identity politics. It used to be about, you don't want to become like Britain because it's the sick man of Europe.
Ed, what do you think? I suspect, I'm going to say what I suspect you think before I hear what you think, but I suspect you're a bit, you share my feeling, which is that we as Brits don't take very kindly to American criticism, but that might be because we're a bit like a boiled frog. We just haven't really noticed our decline, or we've got used to it. And to Americans coming to visit, they often talk about how nice London is. Tucker Carlson did yesterday. He said London is really nice. But at the same time, they feel that there's something deeply wrong with the country.
My experience of being in the States the last month or so was the thing that people kept on raising, even people who didn't know I was a writer, never heard of me, was the free speech issue, which they found just totally unbelievable and baffling. The fact that you can go to jail for tweeting, that the police will turn up at your door if you say something about whatever the hot button issue is. And they found that incredibly just disturbing and incomprehensible even. And I guess Americans are unusual amongst Western countries in really valuing free speech. And these problems obviously are found in France and Germany as well. But Britain has obviously more of a sentimental value to a lot of Americans, which I think is underplayed. There are a lot of Anglophiles, a lot of people who do take pride in their sort of British origins, even though it's not expressed as a hyphenated identity. And I think a lot of them do generally feel quite sad that what they see as a real decline. London compared to any American city is obviously incredibly safe when it comes to serious crimes. When it comes to sort of mid-level crimes, theft of mobile phones and watches, it's very bad. It compares pretty poorly with any American city, I think. You're not going to get murdered, but you may well have your watch stolen, and it's happened to quite a few American tourists. But London and Britain also were starting from a very, very good base. We had incredible institutions, an incredibly safe, ordered society, huge advantages which no other Western country has, and we have thrown them away. I think I know Americans often see it through the social media lens, which is incredibly negative, and it's probably only like 70% as bad as they think it is. But I don't agree; it's not a problem.
I'm often struck Americans in public transport. I mean, there have obviously been horrific crimes on American public transport systems recently. There's been some in Britain too. But Americans are much more nervous about taking public transport generally, I find. I remember when I was living in DC, I was always told never take the metro after a certain time at night. And I would, and it really wasn't that bad. But, maybe I just got lucky. But it did seem to me that
the subway is full of really mental people. The New York subway I found really.
The New York subway is quite frightening.
It's not like 80s level, obviously, but it's just really horrible and squalid and full of crazy people. And when you came back on the Elizabeth line, you think, wow, imagine visiting London on the Elizabeth line. You think this is the most advanced country in the world afterwards. I mean, it must be run by a sort of oligarchy of super geniuses who get everything right.
America, of course, used to have beautiful public transport, widely available. It made a choice in the 1950s, in some cases, to literally tear it up to replace it with the car. Now, I say this because much of the conversation in America about Britain is really a way of adding perspective to debates about America among Americans. And when they do that, you see your own country being completely misperceived. Now, one thing Tucker Carlson said really irritated me, and it was regards the Second World War. And he did this thing he does of saying, okay, Hitler killed people, a ton of people. Okay, that was bad. It's a long time ago. It was bad. He said, it's really weird. We're talking about the Holocaust here. And he sort of said, that was a bad thing. Okay, a long time ago. And then he claims that since then, since this great victory, Britain's been in total decline, as if we lost our nerve and we gave up. And we did that because we fell out of love with ourselves. This to me is a complete misreading of British history. Life in Britain got so much better after 1945 because we made a policy choice that Tucker Carlson and the American right doesn't agree with. We embraced social democracy. We went from an empire that was sustained, okay, from a consumption point of view, it was great, but an empire that was sustained largely to the benefit of a tiny group of people, to a social democracy that sought to redistribute opportunity and money to the working class. If I had to go back in time, I would much rather choose to live in Britain between, say, about 1951 and about 1979, rather than I would during the supposed glory days of the empire. So what Tucker Carlson is doing is taking my experience of my country's history. He's reimagining it, because what he's doing is he's using it to tell a story about this is what happens when countries go to war, they become overextended, and then they embrace socialism, and they go soft. So he's using my country, misrepresenting my country, in order to say something to Americans about who they should vote for. And I just don't recognize the historical story that he's telling. Yes, Britain did win the Second World War. This is a popular narrative now on the right, that we somehow lost the war because we lost the empire. The empire was of no benefit to my family or the vast majority of working class Britons. We were well rid of it. And once we got rid of it, we started doing the things we should have been doing, like building a health service, teaching people, and eradicating poverty.
Well, I don't want to say, I don't want to indulge in kind of, sorry, Ed, go ahead. But I was just going to say, actually, I don't want to indulge in British self-hatred, but I did think it was odd that Tucker said Britain won both world wars without mentioning America. Because, I mean, would we have won the Second World War without America? I think it's very debatable.
Obviously not, right?
Probably not. Almost certainly not. No. But
Hitler would not have been defeated without us. And this is a point which, again, irritates me. The enormous self-sacrifice, again, I don't care that we lost the empire, not sure we should have had it in the first place, but the sacrifice of empire was worth it because it kept Britain in the war, and that's what eventually dragged America into it too.
I mean, I'm not sure about the debate about this. I mean, the Second World War stuff, I kind of switched off, to be honest, because when people start, I don't know, it feels like when people start debating about who started the Second World War, I'm wasting my time. But I mean, I think in terms of prestige and relative wealth, Britain did start to decline after the Second World War. We did fall behind lots of other European countries. I mean, Britain was the wealthiest country in Europe in 1938, for instance. And we did massively fall behind after the Civil War. I mean, in the 70s, during our last sort of moment of crisis, Britain was a cautionary tale as well. In 1973, 74, American politicians were always saying, you don't want to end up like Britain. It's this kind of basket case. And that wasn't entirely dissimilar to now. I totally agree with your point about, all these comparisons are about internal politics, because deep down, almost everyone cares far more about what's happening in their own little part of the world, and they just use foreign countries as a kind of projection. And obviously elements of the American right become obsessed with the Second World War because they didn't want any foreign entanglement, they don't want an empire, they don't want the mass immigration that follows an empire. And Britain is obviously the preeminent example of that in modern times. So, I agree in that case.
No, that's my salient point. I'm just saying to British viewers, when you see Americans slagging off Britain, be conscious they're not really discussing us. They're discussing themselves. And they're using us, and I think misreading our history and our current situation in order to make a political point about now.
Well, they're also discussing whiteness, aren't they? I mean, that's what Tucker Carlson was talking about with Piers Morgan, was the decline in the number of or proportion of white people in our cities, in London in particular. And this is something that we're seeing a lot more of on the American right, is a more explicit white awareness. You could call it white identity politics. Would you call it white identity politics, Tim?
Yes, and again, it's very old. It's stuff that Teddy Roosevelt was espousing. And I'm quite certain that Tucker Carlson might have visited this.
Tucker Roosevelt.
Yeah, quite. I can imagine him entering the arena of the East End in the 1930s and saying, I think London's got a lot of Jews and a lot of Greeks in it, And it's like, yeah, okay. What do you expect? You've gone to London. London is, to a certain extent, and don't take this the wrong way, not exactly a British city. It's one of the great global metropolises. It's a proper international place. So,
But that's a relatively recent phenomenon. London at its great peak, as it were, which would probably be the 1880s in terms of relative power, was almost entirely British. The number of foreigners was minuscule. The actual cosmopolitan nature of London is a very, very recent phenomenon, really, only post-war, and then it accelerated under Blair. My impression of some Americans on the right is their idea. They accept that America is a nation of immigrants and that there is diversity, and there are things they dislike about that, but that's what America is. But they feel troubled seeing the old continent losing its kind of European nature in the same way, and they would prefer it to remain a sort of, I don't want to use the W word, but that's what it is. They would like it to remain that way, and they probably find it a bit shocking to see parts of London totally transformed.
Well, and again, I come back to one of the reasons why it has transformed is a legacy of empire. So if Britain's decline is measured in its loss of empire, well, we have changed the way we have because we once insisted upon having an empire and colonizing people.
Mm. Well, Tim, one aspect of this, which I think is worth talking about, is the internet, social media, and so on, and what is called sometimes, I think, decline porn. And we have an interesting article in the latest edition of Spectator World, which I highly recommend everyone subscribe to. And it's about the e-girls who get rich or get lots of online engagement by selling European decline to America online. And this is a fad. It's a fad on the internet to sort of post pictures of, it's usually a white girl in a particularly poor or rubbish-looking part of a London city or a British city or a European city. And this does particularly well in America, it seems. Are you aware of this trend, and do you think that's relevant, Tim or Ed?
I'm not sure I heard about that particular phenomenon. I mean, I've heard of decline porn. I don't think I can be in a position to moralize on this. I'm probably the Bonnie Blue of decline porn, I guess.
Bonnie Blue herself is decline porn. I mean, that's
yeah, that's true. People like reading about this stuff. It's fascinating.
But can I make for decline? I'm quite comfortable with decline. To me, Englishness to some degree is bound up with decline. One of my favourite things is that when the Conservative Party came back to power in 1951, it had to weigh up whether or not to massively cut taxes. And it surveyed British workers and said to them, if you were able to keep more of your own income, would you work harder? And the survey came back and overwhelmingly said that the British workers would rather have less money and do less work. And at the time, people said, yeah, because we're not American. In the 1950s, when we've had all this debate before, whether or not Britain should be, as I say, a social democracy, or it should be a kind of libertarian capitalist paradise like America. And we very consciously chose social democracy in part because we thought that it was closer to the spirit of Britishness, and that Americans worked very hard, and that was admirable, that kind of Calvinist frugality and hard work. But we also thought it made them unhappy. And we chose after the Second World War to be a bit poorer and to be happier. I'm okay with that.
Well, that is a very interesting point, Tim. But I wonder, Ed, Britain's decline has been alleviated, I'd say, or economic decline has been alleviated by the great power of the American economy. I mean, if you read Angus Hansen's book Vassal State, essentially America runs the British economy. So what wealth there is comes from American investment, and there are lots of good arguments Angus Hansen makes them as to why this is a terrible thing. But nonetheless, what little wealth we have is very dependent on a very powerful American economy, is it not?
Yes. I mean, I'm less happy about us becoming poor, just because I think it makes us weaker and more vulnerable to other countries, and basically all power, I think, is downstream of wealth. And Britain was the great influence, the center of influence in the 19th century. People looked up to Britain, and even if they disliked it, they tried to imitate it because Britain was much wealthier than other countries. And I think as we become poorer, we become weaker and more dependent, and obviously open not just to states, but the more hostile powers who have huge investments in the country. I'm not necessarily against. I just think it puts us in a very weak, feeble position. And I don't know. I would say the only other thing is I think there is a certain darkness to how some Americans see Britain, because their starting point was probably quite high, and it was probably a bit of a Harry Potter and the Queen, and then they see UK aesthetic threads on what Luton looks like, and it just doesn't compute because they wouldn't obviously visit Luton when they come to Britain, so they wouldn't have no idea that that's what parts of Britain are like. And my basic impression of visiting America is that even there are very rich areas of America, but even not particularly rich areas are really rich looking compared to Britain, most of Britain. Like even compared to the nice bits of Britain, let alone the industrial wastelands, it's really noticeable how poorer we are now.
Tim, what you like decline, but I mean, I think this week in particular, with the budget and so on, I mean, Tucker Carlson timed it almost too well, because there's a lot of Britons feeling the country has gone. There's a lot of talk about people migrating out of Britain. There's a lot of despair, I would say, that we're not just in decline, we are rotting.
Yeah, well, if America feels sorry for us, you could make it easier to migrate there. I mean, Trump has actually made it a bit harder to get there. And where else are we going to go? Hungary? That's the popular idea, isn't it? I think Tucker Carlson is. I think the pairing of him and Piers Morgan is very good because they're very similar. They're men whose primary talent is an ability to spot a trend and jump on it at just the right moment. So in some ways, it can look like they're starting it. I mean, for him to interview Piers Morgan's not a conservative. He used to edit The Mirror. He is left-wing. He's a social, economic liberal. They had a conversation about abortion, and Piers Morgan said, I'm all for a woman's right to choose, and Tucker looked disgusted. But what Piers has done down the years is he's gone things like, the gun debate's going to be big. So when he was on CNN, he went anti-gun. And then he sort of thought, Gaza, I'm going to be pro-Gaza and anti-Israel. And he very cleverly, by that burp was my dog, by the way. So he very cleverly got ahead of that. And Tucker's done the same thing. Tucker has noticed post-Trump where the right was going, and he's gone with it. And part of that is about denigrating Europe and buying into this declinist narrative. But I think what I'm watching as a performance, I'm watching Tucker trying to figure out the next place to go versus Piers Morgan, who, as I say, I don't even really regard as a conservative and not necessarily the best perspective, the most representative perspective to have on the state of Britain.
No, well, I mean, I think on COVID, for instance, Piers Morgan, performed a spectacular volte-face as he's acknowledged now, I think. But I think, I would say, I think Tucker Carlson does have quite clear principles. I mean, he's always been anti-war. He hasn't always been anti-war. He supported the Iraq War, but I knew him long before this was popular politics. And he was pretty anti the kind of neoconservative military agenda then. So I don't think he's just a sort of media opportunist, but maybe I'm biased. Ed, what do you think?
No, but he had, look, okay, the other thing we haven't discussed, the elephant in the room here is Nick Fuentes, right? A few weeks ago, he chose completely unnecessarily to elevate Nick Fuentes. And as others have said, if you want someone who is concerned with European decline, if you want someone who's anti-war, if you want a right-winger who's critical of Israel, have me on. You don't need to have on the guy who says he quite likes Hitler. And that I think is the cynicism of Tucker. He did it because he could see Fuentes was on the rise, and he wanted to be associated with that phenomenon.
Perhaps that's right. Ed, should we go back to the free speech issue? Because I think that's something in Britain, you're right to say Americans are really shocked by it. They are. And they're onto something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, particularly, I thought it was interesting, Tucker raising the abortion point, which is something J.D. Vance has talked about, and the praying. People being arrested for praying. That is deeply shocking to anyone with any sort of basic sense of liberty. And you don't have to be American to find that shocking. But yet, it's not made up. It's not fake news. It is happening in Britain.
Yeah. I mean, pretty much every story you read, you think this can't be real, and then no, it is real. I mean, people, the police do turn up at people's houses for sort of Facebook posts, the most innocuous stuff. People do get sentenced to 2 years in jail for a Halloween costume, although, that man won an appeal. These stories are kind of mind-blowing, and when you read about them, you think that cannot really happen, but it does. And in that case, the Americans are completely right. What I feel is a big problem is that not enough people care about it, because the people involved are often, kind of difficult people, or unsympathetic in various ways, or kind of like, Facebook, loudmouth, whatever. But the lack of care that people have for these kind of fundamental issues, especially when the people who would support these or prosecute these actions would see themselves as kind of moderate, centrist kind of types, bland, middle of the road political moderates. And what actually happens in Britain is pretty extreme. But, as I said, it does. I mean, it's similar. Worse things happen in France and Germany. People get sent to jail for basically reading out crime statistics, and it's America that's kind of unusual in actually caring about freedom of speech. It's quite the norm in most of Europe. I would, my thinking has always been that Americans have the First Amendment, and so Britain doesn't. And so when we adopt kind of radical progressive ideas, we don't have the protections that Americans have. So these ideas that come out of basically of American colleges and then get taken up by the American upper class, we are almost like a naive population. We can't resist them. So in Britain, someone will actually get arrested for misgendering someone, or they will go to jail for saying something which is considered racist, while Americans have that kind of fundamental right to protection.
Tim, what are your thoughts on speech?
Yeah. I think one thing I greatly admire America for, and I despair in the British, is America respects issues of process. So in this country right now, we're talking about limiting further the access to trial by jury. And I sitting in on the parliamentary debates about that. The government's attitude is there are victims, not people who are alleged victims. There are victims who are waiting a long time for trial, and that is unjust. So we must speed through trials by reducing trial by jury. Well, as I say, in the eyes of the law, technically, they are alleged victims, and the people who are accused are the defendants. And we actually have Magna Carta, and we have a trial by jury, not actually to help accusers, but to defend the liberties and rights of those who are accused. And this is something which I think is historically woven into the DNA of America. One of the issues that triggered the American Revolution was the threatened suspension of trial by jury by the British. So Americans are very good at saying, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I believe you have a constitutional right to say it. And I think that's something that we've definitely lost in this country, and that depresses me enormously. I mean, when I think about decline and Britain, I feel about it much more in relation to issues of character and principle than I do in some of the material stuff that I hear American commentators banging on. It just doesn't bother me that London's less white than it used to be, right? But what does concern me is when I feel British people are not behaving as I think British people should behave, which is questions of politeness, civility, and respect for due process, and not doing things like forming a mob and jumping on someone because we've decided in advance that person's guilty of something.
Tim and Ed, I think we will end it there. But thank you very much for coming on to Americano.
Thank you.
Very good to have you both on.